So far in this course, we've taken a look at several ideas for theories of ethics, that is, theories for what makes something right or wrong. We took a look at moral subjectivism and at cultural relativism and found that they had so many problems that they just weren't going to work as theories of ethics. The first major theory of ethics that we will take a look at, one that has really survived the test of time, is a very important ethical theory, is an ethical theory known as utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is composed of three different elements. There are three different ideas that when you combine them together give you utilitarianism. And those ideas are first consequentialism, second hedonism, and third sum totaling and maximization of well-being. Now, I don't expect that these will make perfect sense to you right off. Hedonism, certainly we talked about in the previous lecture, and we'll mention it briefly again. But I wanted to talk about each of these ideas in turn to show you how, when you combine them together, you can get an ethical theory and really just how that ethical theory works. First, let's start with consequentialism. Consequentialism is an idea, it's a very simple idea, and it goes something like this. So imagine that you have two buttons that you could push. If you push button number 1, you give a child candy. If you push button number 2, you give a kitten an electric shock. Who would do such a thing? But what I want you to consider is that the act of pushing a button is all by itself morally neutral. Okay, just imagine that you had a button that didn't do anything. You push the button, it wasn't hooked up to anything. It seems like whether you push it or not just doesn't matter, right? You could, whereas the buttons that either give a child candy or give a kitten an electric shock, they acquire moral status, right? Pushing those buttons acquires moral status because of what happens after you push the button, what pushing the button causes to happen. That's the basic idea behind consequentialism. And so consequentialism takes the idea that consequences matter as far as it will go. It takes it to its logical conclusion. And consequentialism is the view that consequences are all that matters to the moral status of an action, right? So pushing a button all by itself doesn't do anything. It's what the button does that gives pushing a particular button its moral status. Okay? So that's the first idea that makes up utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is a kind of consequentialism. It's a consequentialist moral theory. There are other consequentialist moral theories than utilitarianism, but utilitarianism is sort of the biggest, most important one, and so that's the one we're going to take a look at in this course. The second idea behind that goes into utilitarianism is the idea of hedonism. This is an idea we've already seen in the writings of Epicurus and in the previous lecture. And so it's obvious that good consequences are good and that bad consequences are bad. But of course, we need to know what actually makes the consequences good and what makes other consequences bad. We need to have some meaning in terms of good or bad. And so for that, we need a theory of well-being. We need a theory of when somebody's life goes well for them. And that's, if you'll remember from the previous lecture, exactly what hedonism is. Okay, remember, hedonism is the view that pleasure is the only intrinsic good and pain is the only intrinsic evil. Okay, and so when we combine this with consequentialism, we get to see that the good consequences are the ones that cause pleasure, and the bad consequences are the ones that cause pains. Okay, so that's what we mean by good and bad. We mean pleasure and pain. Okay, so that's how consequentialism and hedonism combine to be part of a utilitarian moral theory. So a note about this, Schaefer-Landau, instead of using the word pleasure, says happiness in his text here. I think he's trying to be more expansive, try to talk about theories of consequentialist theories beyond just utilitarianism, but classically utilitarianism involves is a hedonist theory, right? And so they very much mean pleasure as the rather than sort of this broader happiness. And so it's one thing to say that consequences are all that matter, and that good consequences are pleasures and bad consequences are pains. And but then what we need is some way of deciding what to do when we have all these different consequences, some of which are pleasure, some of which are pain, some of which are a little of both. Now, what do we do with all those consequences? How do we weigh them? How do we use them to decide what to do? And that's where the third idea that makes up utilitarianism comes in. That's the idea of sum totaling and maximization. And so the idea behind utilitarianism is to anticipate the consequences of every action that you have available to you, and then total up the amount of pleasure versus pain. So say you have three different things that you could do, total up all of the pleasure and pain that results from option A, all of the pleasure and pain that results from option B, all of the pleasure and pain that results from option C, and then you get a kind of score for each of those actions. And the one that has the best score, that is the most pleasure and the least pain, is the one that's the best one. And that's very important about utilitarianism. What utilitarians will do is they will add all this stuff up, and then they will choose, that's the sum totaling, that's adding it all up, and then they will choose the single best option available, right? So out of all the actions that you have available to you, the morally correct one is the one action that has the best overall consequences. All of the others are the wrong action. Okay, that's what we mean by maximization, picking the best one. Okay, so you total up all the pleasures and pains and you pick the best option. The best option is what utilitarianism says is the right action. Any action that's not the best is not the right one. But of course, how does one total all that up? Well, to answer that question, I'd like to bring in the writing from Jeremy Bentham. Bentham is one of the most famous and very early proponents of utilitarian moral theory, and is certainly still one of the best advocates for the theory. One of the people who describes it very, very well. Bentham was British. He lived from 1748 to 1832. This is a photograph of Jeremy Bentham taken in 2012. Now, if you're really paying attention, you'll notice that that's very much after his death. And so you might say, well, what do you mean it's a picture taken of him after? No, it's actually Jeremy Bentham, and it is taken many, many years after his death. And the reason for that is rather idiosyncratic. Um, uh, so this is at Bentham's own request. Upon his death, he was publicly dissected for science, okay, publicly dissected. Um, and then had this, which is called an auto icon, okay, created by padding his skeleton with hay and dressing it in his clothes. His head was mummified, but it doesn't look very lifelike. They used to display it with the body, but after a series of essentially student pranks where the head kept getting stolen and put in odd places, they don't keep it on. They don't put it on display anymore. You can Google it and Google Bentham's head. You can see what it looks like now. But again, it does not look particularly lifelike, as most mummified corpses don't. And so the display here actually that's a wax head, but with some of Bentham's actual hair. So for a long time, he was wheeled out during Royal Society meetings, and now he's only sort of the box with the auto icon in it is only sort of wheeled out to the meetings for very special occasions anymore. And so I just want to say a couple things about Bentham before moving on to talk about his contribution to utilitarianism. Bentham himself is we owe an awful lot about sort of our modern thinking about morality and about the law to Bentham and a lot of his reforms. So, for example, he was one of the great uh, advocates of what we might call sort of proportional or limited punishment. His idea, because he was a utilitarian, was that any kind of criminal punishment that was um, that the idea behind punishment is to make the action cost something, right? So people have to weigh the risk of getting caught and they have to weigh the penalty of doing a particular thing versus whatever kind of benefit they get from it. And so the idea is that if the penalty is enough that the crime doesn't pay, then the penalty is doing its job. And Bentham's view was that any penalty more than that was just needless cruelty. And so a lot of the really draconian punishments for things really got scaled back. And in general, we try and punish things that are really just not that serious, not very seriously, right? We try and just to be enough of a counter incentive is the idea, and that's a kind of idea that modern jurisprudence takes very seriously, and Bentham is one of the big proponents of that idea. He was he was very influential in a lot of ways and extremely well respected. And I mean, just think about this. Lots of people have lots of very weird requests for what's to be done with their bodies after they're dead. This being put in a box and kept on display and wheeled into meetings is very weird. And it's the kind of thing that almost anybody, if they had asked their relatives or friends to do, people would, they would read this in their will and be like, yeah, whatever. He's dead. We're not going to do that. It might be something that's, oh, while alive, he's, oh, yeah, sure, I'll do all this stuff for you after that. And then once they die, you're like, yeah, never mind. That's just too weird. It's a testament to how respected Bentham was that he asked them to do all these weird things and they did it. So on with his proposal. So in his writing, he details what we later call the hedonistic calculus. Okay, and that makes it sound very mathy, and it is actually. This is one of the things that people often like about utilitarianism, is that it's very quantifiable. It's very concrete. It reduces this question of is something moral or immoral to a set of much smaller questions that are much more easily answerable, that seem much more sort of nailed down. And that's, again, a thing that people really like about utilitarianism. It's one of the things that makes it a pretty good moral theory. And so here's how it works. So again, you have a variety of options available to you. You can take all sorts of different actions. And the idea is you should say, okay, here are the actions that are available, and for each of them, you sort of total up all of its consequences. And the way that you think about its consequences are as follows. The first thing you do is you think about, again, the pleasures and the pains that it causes. And you think about the intensity of each pleasure or pain. That is, the more intense the pleasure, the higher the number you get. The more intense the pain, the higher the negative number you get. And this is a little bit like what people do in terms of, you might say, well, how do you put a number on a pain? It's like, well, I mean, we do it kind of all the time. You do it more or less comparatively, right? If you establish some kind of a scale, then you can get people to say things that are sort of reasonably accurate. So if you go into an emergency room or a medical clinic, you'll very often see this a picture much like is on the right. It's a pain scale, and in general, they want to know how bad your pain is. And of course, there are some people who have these very odd ideas. They've got a hangnail, and they're like, "It's an 8, it's an 8," right? And, it's not really. And sometimes people might be in very severe pain. They'll say, "Well, it's not that bad," But for the most part, this is a fairly accurate diagnostic tool. I mean, most people, when they're suffering from one kind of a pain or other, will give numbers that are more or less in the ballpark with each other for that particular kind of an issue. And so that's the idea, is you first assign a kind of number, and it's somewhat arbitrary, but not entirely arbitrary, and can be made reasonably consistent if you specify the criteria well enough for all these pleasures and pains. So intensity of the pleasures and pains matters. Like something that causes really intense, horrible pain, right? Something that's really, really terrible is going to be worse than something that causes just a little bit of pain. And something that causes lots and lots and lots of great pleasure, right, is going to be better than something that causes a very mild pleasure. And so intensity matters. Okay? So figure out the intensity of the pleasures and pains that are caused by each of your actions. And then, of course, you figure out the duration of the pleasures and pains that are caused by your actions. Because, of course, you might choose, if you had a very intense pleasure that didn't last very long, that might not be as good as a much milder pleasure that lasted a very long time. Okay, so duration, you can sort of, in a sense, multiply the duration times the pleasure or the pain, right? Mild pains that last a long, long, long time might be worse than very bad pains that only last a little bit. That's the whole, well, when ripping off a Band-Aid, you do something like this kind of a calculation. You can either have the very short, intense pain, where you can sort of drag it out and have a sort of less pain, but for a lot longer. And that's, people might be divided on that one, but that's the idea. That's the calculation that people go through. You must weigh the certainty, of course, of each pleasure or pain. Because we're talking about consequences, we're talking about the future, which is not something that anybody exactly knows. And so when you're thinking about what you should do, you should think about the probabilities, right, of what's really likely and what's not as likely. And so you might have several of your actions. You might say one of your options, you say, well, it's very likely to have this consequence, and then you weigh all the pains and pleasures of that. But you say, it's slightly likely to have this other consequence, right? So the idea is that maybe some consequence has a very small chance of a total disaster, and so maybe you'll avoid that option. Maybe some chance has some option has a rather large chance of something really, really great, and so you'll really seek that one out. But you have to consider probability, right? So you might represent probability as a number between 0 and 1, 0 being completely, completely impossible, 1 being certain, and then, between there, of course, probability. And then you can multiply the number that you have from getting intensity times duration, and that again will continue to give you a kind of mathematical score for how well each option's doing. The fourth thing that Bentham identifies is the propinquity of each pleasure or pain. And propinquity is one of those unfamiliar words. People use that word a lot, but really it's the only English word that means what it means as far as I can tell. What it means is nearness in time. Okay? And so the idea is that we tend to think things are more valuable if they're going to happen sooner, or at least certainly more important if they're going to happen sooner. So the image at the right that you see is what we call a propinquity indifference curve, or actually two such propinquity indifference curves, or temporal discounting curves, sometimes people might call them. The idea is this, that we feel like the further something is in the future, the less valuable it is, or the less important it is. Which is one of the reasons why people tend to have such a hard time preparing adequately for retirement, because in a lot of ways that's so far in the future that we just kind of don't think of it as being important at all. What happens is that people naturally discount the future a little too much, especially the future. But the two lines on the right, you see there's a difference between somebody who's much more patient and somebody who is much more impulsive. A very impulsive person is going to see things in the fairly near future as being very discounted compared to the more patient person who sees things in the future as being sort of less discounted. So the way you could think of it is this. I could say, well, I could offer you, say, $1,000 right now, or $6,000 in say a month. Would you take it? Right? Would you wait a month for an extra, for the extra money, right? And I think most people would. Okay, then okay, all right. Would you wait a year for that extra? Okay, would you wait, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, whatever? And so the idea is that your willingness to wait for that extra payoff sort of diminishes the further that extra payoff is, right? Now, of course, if it's a really, really huge payoff, you might be willing to wait longer, etc. So the idea is that all of those things have some relevance to how people weigh consequences. So consequences that are nearer in time are going to be more important than consequences that are far off in the future when we're weighing one option against the other. The fifth thing he talks about is fecundity. Okay, it's another really great English word, but it's the only English word that means what it means. Fecundity refers to the ability of something, or the tendency of something, to produce more things like it. Okay, you see an example generating here. Rabbits are notoriously fecund because they generate more rabbits. Okay, they generate more things that are the same. The same can be said of some kinds of pleasures and pains. So some kinds of pains bring along with them more pains. So if anybody's ever sort of had a back injury, you'll notice that all the pain the back injury causes can cause all sorts of poor posture and sometimes a lot of sedentary habits, which bring about other pains, and it can just sort of snowball and just sort of cause all sorts of other things. And so, say back pain is a very fecund pain. It's a kind of pain that tends to bring more pain. Okay, whereas a very fecund pleasure is a kind of pleasure that tends to bring more pleasure. And so, like enjoying fine literature, right? I mean, it takes practice to really appreciate good literature, but it's the sort of thing that as you can appreciate good literature, you become more able to more easily appreciate good literature, things like that. Or playing tennis, right, or something like that. The idea is that as you get much better at it, which takes a lot of sort of work and effort, well, then it gets easier to enjoy it. And so the idea is that it's a kind of pleasure that can bring about more pleasure. And so getting good at thing is one of those kinds of things that tends to be a fecund kind of pleasure. It's a pleasure that brings more of the same. Okay. Also, one has to consider the purity of the pleasure or pain that's being caused, because lots of times, lots of things aren't purely pleasurable or purely painful, but often involve some mix of the two. Okay, and so what you want to do is you want to bring about things that are more purely pleasurable and avoid things that are more purely painful, and bring about things that are also sort of more pleasurable than painful. And so the idea is you have to consider there being a potential mix of the two. And then, of course, you also have to consider the extent, and this is the big one. This is the one that makes this quite a challenge. Is that you have to consider all that for everybody who's actually affected by your action. So for everybody who's affected, they have, they're affected in all the pleasures and pains that are caused for them. All of those pleasures and pains will have an intensity, a duration, a certainty, a propinquity, a fecundity, and a purity for each person affected. Okay, and so when you're thinking to yourself, my gosh, this is a dizzying array of numbers, well, you're right, okay? But this is the way to be as thorough as possible in answering the question, what is actually the right action? And so we'll talk a little bit about using something like the hedonistic calculus here in a few minutes. But that's the hedonistic calculus. That's Bentham's proposal for just what it would mean to fully consider what of your available options is actually the best one. And the closer you come to following this procedure, the better the decision you're likely to make. And so let's talk about some misunderstandings of utilitarian moral theory. Right? This is some of the ways that people tend to misinterpret how it goes. And so one of the things that people often say is that utilitarianism says to do whatever benefits the majority. And they usually use this as kind of criticism. They're like, it's majoritarian tyranny or whatever. Well, that's not really correct, okay? What instead utilitarianism says to do is to choose the available option that has the best overall consequences. And so it might be better in some cases to choose something that has a very large benefit in terms of pleasure to a minority over some other option that confers a comparatively small benefit to a majority, right? Because the idea is that this huge benefit to the smaller number of people might have a greater total pleasure than this small benefit to a majority of people. Okay, and so this is where sort of extent and some other things come in, right? So intensity, duration, etc. And so another thing that people often say about utilitarianism is that we must choose whatever creates the greatest happiness, right? So a combination between the last one and this one is something like the greatest good for the greatest number, and that's how people often paraphrase utilitarianism. And it's not radically incorrect, but you got to be a little bit more specific here, got to be a little bit more accurate. But this also isn't exactly right. So something that generated really great happiness and a great misery would be worse than something that produced a little happiness and no misery. So again, you don't necessarily have to choose whatever creates the greatest happiness. You choose whatever creates the greatest overall consequences. And I'll take a moment here to add that another misunderstanding people often have about utilitarianism, right when they first learn it, is assuming that you have to consider uh, yourself, right, in this, like, so the person that's doing all this has to choose what is like pleasurable for them or painful for. That's actually not true. The person who's acting, right, all of their pleasures and pains count just as much as everybody else's who is affected by the action, right? So it's how things affect everybody that they affect. That's what's very important here. So I wanted to also talk about some basic criticisms, some criticisms of utilitarianism that utilitarians have a very easy time answering, right? They're not very good criticisms, but sometimes they're the first ones that occur to a person. So one of those criticisms is this. They say, look, if the morality of our actions depends on their consequences, then we don't know whether something is moral or not until all of the consequences play out. Right? That seems to be a problem with the theory, right? It's not really a big problem with the theory. And it's true, right? It's true that we won't know whether something is moral or not until all the consequences play out. Like that's a fact. But it's not really an objection to the theory. It doesn't create a problem for utilitarians, right? Because that response doesn't provide any reason to believe that morality doesn't in fact depend on the consequences, and it's no reason not to try to bring about the best overall consequences. Okay, so whether or not we know whether we've done the right thing, still the idea is we think that the right thing is the thing that makes the best overall consequences, and that's what we ought to try to do, is create the best overall consequences. So that criticism doesn't really damage the theory at all. Another criticism goes like this. It says, look, say that I do something reasonable and it turns out badly. I will have done the wrong thing because I, did the thing that didn't have the best consequences. And so I therefore should have been unreasonable. And so utilitarianism can then require me to be unreasonable. Let me give you an example of such a case. Right? So imagine that you're a doctor and you have a patient come to you with a particular condition. Let's call it condition X. And so say you have two medicines, medicine A and medicine B. All right? Medicine A works pretty well with most people who have condition X. Medicine B does not work very well for most people, but there's a really small percentage of people, let's call it say 1% of people, that medicine B completely cures, but that medicine, uh, uh, but that that 1% of people are actually harmed by medicine A. Right? So that's the calculation. So if some patient comes to you with condition X, you say, well, let's go with the thing that actually works for the vast majority of people that have this, and say that they just happen to be in that 1% that gets harmed by medicine A, and that's what you gave them. Of course, what you did harmed the patient. If you had given them medicine B, you would have cured them. And so it seems like your very reasonable decision turned out badly, and so was actually the wrong thing. It was wrong to do the reasonable thing in giving them medicine A, right? Well, that's a very interesting, very thoughtful objection, but it turns out, again, this doesn't really damage utilitarianism particularly, because the utilitarians will say this. They'll say that it's improper to mix up whether an action was right and whether it was praiseworthy. Those aren't the same thing. Okay, so if your action did not accomplish the best outcome, it wasn't the right action. And in a sense, we get that from this example. The right action would have been to cure the disease, which would have been given to give medicine B. That would have actually ended up with having the best consequences. Right? But of course, we get better consequences, or tend to, when we praise reasonable actions rather than when we praise unreasonable ones. And so the doctor who gave medicine B to one of their patients, we would have said, that's foolish, right? It was much more likely that they would have been helped by A, even if they had ended up getting lucky and having their patient be helped by medicine B. Whereas if you give medicine A, you say, look, that's the reasonable thing to do. You should do the reasonable thing. And if it happens to not work out, you say, yes, you did the reasonable thing and it didn't work out, right? And so the utilitarian can pretty easily take a stock of this objection, and it doesn't really damage the theory very much. And so we'll talk a lot more in the next week about some of the difficulties that utilitarianism does face, some of the things that people have found to be sort of not perfect about it. But for now, I wanted to talk about the things that people really like about utilitarianism, the sorts of things that really attract people to utilitarianism as a moral theory, and what makes it a really famous, really important moral theory for us. And the first of those is its impartiality. Okay, because what it does is it weighs all of the pains and pleasures that are caused by an act. We're sort of counting everybody's pains and pleasures equally. One way to put it is that everybody counts as one, right? Nobody's pains, nobody's pleasures are any more important than anyone else's. It's a very extreme form of impartiality, and that's something a lot of people like in a moral theory. Whatever a moral theory should be, it seems like it ought to be impartial. It ought not to treat some people as important and other people as less important. And just sort of weighing pleasures and pains seems to have that effect. It is an extremely impartial moral theory. Second is that it's a flexible moral theory, in the sense that utilitarians do not say that a certain type of action is always wrong or always right. Some examples would be, say, lying. Utilitarians aren't going to say that lying is always wrong. They're not going to say it's always right either. They're going to say, well, it depends on what consequences a particular lie has. And if you're in a situation where the best possible consequences are achieved only by lying, well, then that's the right thing to do in that context. And I think utilitarians will say, look, I mean, there are lots of actions, say like murder, that pretty much never result in the best overall consequences. It's almost always better, say, not to murder somebody than it is to murder them. But they said, look, if you're in some really wacky circumstance in which that's the only way to get the best overall consequences, well, then that's the kind of thing you have to do. And so they don't give these universal answers about what is morally, what type of action is morally correct or not. They only talk about specific acts in specific circumstances. And again, that's something that a lot of people really like about utilitarianism. They think that morality, a moral theory should be flexible. It should be sensitive to context. There should be an easy way to generate exceptions to sorts of general rules. Also, demandingness. Okay. In this sense, utilitarianism makes a ruling on each and every action, no matter how small, because every action has consequences. Okay, and so, because every action is one of a number of possible actions that could have been taken. And so the idea is that utilitarianism can actually tell us about all of our actions, right? Whereas maybe a competing moral theory would have a hard time with some kinds of actions that seem sort of less consequential or whatnot. Utilitarianism really does weigh in on the entirety of our actions, and that's something that people tend to like about it as well. And finally, Schaefer-Landau points out this one. It includes a very expansive moral community. Basically, anything that can feel pleasure or pain is considered, morally speaking. And this includes animals, children, and adults with severe mental handicaps. Bentham has a rather famous quote when he's talking about treatment of specifically animals. Um, he points out correctly that they exhibit every appearance of feeling pains much like ours and experiencing pleasures much like ours. And so the famous quote goes something like this. He says that the question is not can they talk, right, or can they reason. The operative question is can they suffer. Okay, and so this sort of explains why we think it's generally wrong to just cause pain to an animal for no reason. Um, it's one of the, it's very cut and dry for a utilitarian that say pains are pains. Pains are simply bad, no matter whose pains they are. Again, this is a kind of it shows you just how impartial utilitarianism really is. It doesn't even restrict its application just to humans, right? It would include look at it, if it can feel pain, it counts. Okay, that's if it can feel pleasure, it counts, and it counts just as much as everybody else who can feel pain or pleasure. And so those are some of the things that people very much like about utilitarianism. So in the next week, we'll be talking about some of the things that people perhaps have trouble with, or some of the problems that are generated by utilitarianism. But for now, we want to get an idea of the theory and how the theory works and what people tend to like about it. So for a brief recap, the theory of utilitarianism is composed of three elements. The element of consequentialism, this idea that that consequences are really all that matters, that what makes consequences good or bad is that they are pleasures or pains. Those are the kinds of consequences we're interested in because utilitarians adopt a hedonistic view of well-being. And what you're supposed to do is total up all of the pleasures and pains that would result from each of several actions you could take, and you pick the option that gives you the best overall balance between pleasures and pains, the ones that give you the best overall consequences, the most pleasures for the least pains out of all your available options. So that's utilitarianism, and that's how it works.